Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You've joined us for episode 3 of our Deep Dive Legends series.
That's right. We've already taken a look at the sources behind Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, these, huge figures.
Absolutely. People who just fundamentally changed the game in their industries.
And today we're digging into the material on another one of those legends, Steve Jobs. I mean, say the name and innovation just pops into your head, right?
It really does. So our mission here, like always, is to unpack the sources you've brought, articles, biographies, timelines, all that stuff.
Yeah, we want to pull out the key moments, the big decisions, the principles, really, that defined his career and, well, his legacy.
Exactly. What are the surprising bits hidden in this info? What are the real aha moments when you look at the sources together? We're trying to get the core insights based purely on what's in front of us here.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The sources mention his early life, of course, meeting Steve Wozniak, that famous partnership.
Mm-hmm. And together with Ron Wayne, can't forget him, even briefly they started Apple Computer Inc. back in '76, literally out of a garage, according to one timeline.
The classic Silicon Valley story, isn't it? And they hit success pretty early on, especially with the Apple II.
Right. The timeline calls it maybe the first mass market personal computer. That's a big deal. But as Apple grew, things got, well, messy inside.
They really did.
Yeah.
Jobs was driving projects like the Macintosh, the Lisa, and a really pivotal moment highlighted in the material is that visit to Xerox PR Arc in '79.
Oh, yeah. Seeing the graphical user interface, the GUI, that changed everything.
It profoundly shaped his vision for what Apple's computers should be. But, alongside that innovation, there was serious friction internally.
Yeah, the sources really point to the tension building between Jobs and John Sculley, the CEO at the time.
And that whole dynamic eventually led to Jobs being, well, effectively pushed out, stripped of his executive duties in '85.
And by September that year, he resigned. It's interesting, one source about NXT mentions Apple actually sued NXT right after he left.
Claiming he took employees and insider info, yeah. That suit was eventually dismissed, but wow, it just shows how bad the breakup was.
So he's out of the company he co-founded. You'd think, okay, maybe that's it. But the sources show it was just a massive pivot point.
Exactly. This is where the story gets really fascinating. Because he didn't just vanish. He immediately started NXT Computer. That was 1985. Took several former Apple people with him.
And their goal was pretty ambitious, right? The sources say they wanted to build these high-end workstations for universities, for higher education and research.
And that first hardware product, the NXT Computer, it was visually striking. Nicknamed the Cube.
Oh yeah, that black magnesium case, designed by Hartmut Esslinger, who'd done Apple designs too. But this wasn't cheap.
No way. Initially $6,500, but the sources say it quickly went up to almost 10 grand. So definitely not for everyone.
Targeting a really specific high-end niche market then?
Absolutely. It had some advanced stuff for the late 80s, like a DSP chip for sound, big grayscale screen, built-in Ethernet. But the sources are clear. Sales are, well, limited.
How limited are we talking?
The material suggests maybe only 50,000 XT machines ever sold, total. And they had some hardware issues too, like that magneto-optical drive they used. Apparently it was slow, kind of a pain to use.
Okay, so maybe not a commercial home run on the hardware side.
In terms of units sold,
right.
Definitely not. But here's what's really interesting, and it's an insight from the sources. NXT still pulled in major investment.
Oh, like who?
Ross Perot put in $20 million. Canon invested $100 million. This gave NXT this huge valuation, even without big sales numbers.
Wow. So investors were betting on Jobs, or the underlying tech maybe.
Seems like it, more than just the initial box sales anyway. It shows the power of his vision maybe, that ability to attract capital even when things look tough on the surface.
That's a great point. And the sources show a big shift happened around, what, 91, 93?
Yeah, exactly. They pivoted away from hardware, focused more on the software side. That's where NXT Step really comes into play, their operating system. The sources highlight how advanced it was, especially its object-oriented programming and that really slick GUI. Later, they spun out an application layer called OpenStep.
And this software, this ended up being really important later on, didn't it?
Hugely important, yeah. But NXT also developed something called web objects. The sources describe it as this early, very powerful web application framework for businesses.
Right. I remember reading it was super expensive initially, like $50,000.
Yeah, crazy expensive. But big companies used it. Dell, Disney, BBC, and crucially, Apple later used web objects for parts of the iTunes store and their own online store.
So even the NXT software that wasn't a massive standalone hit had this really long tail, this lasting impact. What about the culture at NextT? The sources mentioned it was pretty unique.
Oh, yeah. Sounds quite different. Like, initially only 2 salary levels, open payroll. They called people members, not employees.
Interesting.
And they even offered health benefits for unmarried and same-sex partners way back then, which is very progressive, though apparently that got withdrawn later.
Huh. So zooming out on NextT, the real insight from these sources isn't the sales figures, it's the influence, the tech legacy.
Totally. That object-oriented stuff, the GUI, it pushed the whole industry. One source flat out says companies like Microsoft with their Cairo project were kind of reacting to NextT's platform.
And here's maybe one of those surprising facts you mentioned earlier.
Go on.
The sources state that Tim Berners-Lee developed the very first web server and web browser on a NextT computer at CERN.
Isn't that wild? And games like Doom and Quake developed on NextT machines too. That's a legacy way beyond 50,000 units.
Absolutely incredible. So NextT was about pushing the tech envelope, even if it wasn't a bestseller. But hang on, that wasn't the only thing Jobs was up to while he was away from Apple.
Not even close. In 1986, he bought the computer graphics division from George Lucas's company, paid $10 million, turned it into Pixar.
And this move, which might have seemed like a side bet on graphics, ended up, well, completely changing animation forever.
Yeah, the sources make it clear. Though initially, it sounds like Jobs tried the same playbook as NextT. Build expensive hardware. The Pixar image computer.
Which, again, didn't really sell, right?
Right. He saw it through that hardware lens first. But Pixar was doing important work with Disney, helping them digitize their animation with something called the CFPS system.
Okay, but what really kept Jobs pouring money in, and one source says he personally put in about $50 million through 91, was the animation itself.
Exactly. The short films John Lasseter was making,
Huh.
like Luxo Jr., which got an Oscar nomination. And Tin Toy actually won the Oscar for Best Animated Short. First CGI film ever to do that.
Wow.
The sources call these shorts the only bright spot. They proved what the tech could do creatively. So Jobs, seeing that, sold off the hardware division, focused on shorts and commercials instead.
Smart pivot. And the really big moment came in 1991.
Yeah. Disney got interested in funding a full-length feature film. That led to a 3-movie deal, and the sources say Jobs was right there, negotiating it.
Setting the stage for Toy Story, released in 95. Groundbreaking stuff, the sources emphasize. First, fully computer-animated feature, and a monster hit.
Absolutely phenomenal success. Huge opening, $365 million worldwide, just massive.
And that success had a direct, immediate financial payoff for Jobs and Pixar. The sources connect Toy Story's success straight to the Pixar IPO timing.
Oh, yeah. The company he'd been funding personally for years. Suddenly it goes public right after Toy Story hits, and boom, it's valued at $1.5 billion. Made him incredibly wealthy almost overnight.
But he didn't just take the money and run, did he? The sources show he went back to Disney and pushed for a better deal.
He did. Wanted a bigger slice of the merchandising pie, the licensing revenue. By 97, they hammered out a new 5-movie deal. This one split costs and profits 50-50. Basically put Pixar on equal footing with Disney Animation. That's a huge negotiation win, detailed right there in the sources.
Powerful stuff. And it's interesting, one biography notes that even after he went back to Apple, Jobs still kept a hand in Pixar. Weekly visits, right?
Yeah, saw it as kind of a side project maybe, but the creative heads there, Lasseter and Ed Catmull, they really valued his input. They talked about his feedback after screenings, calling it a gut punch sometimes, but saying it often made the films much better.
That focus on quality again. And the final chapter for Pixar, as the sources detail it, is Disney buying them outright in 2006 for $7.4 billion.
Yep. And as part of that deal, Jobs joins the Disney board, but he also makes sure Lasseter and Catmull get put in charge of Disney's own animation studios.
There's a great quote from Lasseter and Catmull in one source.
Oh, yeah.
Something like, "Steve took a chance on us. The one thing he always said was simply, make it great. He is why Pixar turned out the way we did." Really sums up his impact there, that relentless push for excellence.
That's a perfect quote. Really captures it. Okay, so while Jobs is building NextT's tech influence and revolutionizing animation at Pixar, what was going on back at Apple?
Well, things were not good. The sources paint a pretty bleak picture. Apple lost over $1 billion, $1.04 billion in 1997 alone.
Ouch. But then, in this amazing twist, Apple bought NextT in 1996.
Right, and the sources are really clear. That $427 million deal wasn't about the NextT Cube hardware.
No, it was all about the software, specifically NextT Step, that operating system technology.
Yeah.
That became the foundation for Apple's next-gen OS project, Rhapsody, which eventually became Mac OS X.
So the tech from the company that struggled commercially became the future of Apple's OS. That's a fantastic insight from the sources connecting those dots.
Then with that acquisition, Jobs comes back.
Yeah.
First as an advisor in late 96, but pretty quickly he's interim CEO by 97.
And the sources lay out these critical steps he took, basically to save the company. First, just ruthless simplification.
Yeah, he canceled something like 70% of Apple's products, slashed the lineup, focused the entire company on only 4 main product areas.
2 desktops, 2 portables, consumer and pro for each. That say no to 1,000 things. Principle in action, right?
Absolutely. Brutal focus. He also brought in that iMac being the first, linking the products to the internet, which was just exploding.
And then there was that Microsoft deal, a $150 million investment. Seemed crazy to some people at the time.
But the sources show how strategic it was.
Yeah.
It buried the hatchet, yeah. But more importantly, it guaranteed Microsoft would keep making Office for the Mac. That was critical to stop people leaving the platform.
The sources also point out this really fundamental change he made to how Apple was structured internally, something about P&L statements.
Yeah, Tim Cook apparently talked about this in a deposition. Jobs got rid of individual profit and loss responsibility for different business units.
Really? Why?
He created just one P&L for the whole company. The thinking, according to the sources, was it would stop the infighting between divisions, force everyone to focus on what was best for Apple overall and for the customer, instead of just their own unit's short-term numbers.
That's a huge organizational shift. Really profound insight there.
Totally. And combine that with launching the Think Different campaign to sort of rebuild the brand's soul.
Yeah.
Well, it worked incredibly fast. The sources, like reports from SlashGear and others, show Apple was back in the black, making $309 million profit just 1 year after Jobs took over as interim CEO.
Wow. From losing over $1 billion to making over $300 million in profit in a year. That is an absolutely stunning turnaround.
And that turnaround, that new foundation, it set the stage for everything that came next, all those iconic products. Guided by these principles that Jobs seemed to live by.
Right. The sources give us some real insight into his approach, like, do what you love.
Yeah, the idea that passion is what fuels perseverance. You needed to push through when everyone doubts you. He talked about following your heart and intuition in that Stanford speech, finding what you love.
Then there's kickstart your brain, creativity as connecting things.
Exactly. The sources give examples. His interest in calligraphy influencing fonts, that trip to India, studying car design, even looking at how Four Seasons hotels work for retail ideas, deliberately seeking diverse experiences.
Even the Apple name coming from an orchard visit, just connecting unrelated dots.
And then that powerful one, say no to 1,000 things. Focus. Simplicity.
He was apparently as proud of what Apple didn't do.
Yeah.
Like the MacBook unibody designed fewer parts, stronger, thinner, eliminating complexity. And you can apply that focus to your own career, your life, right?
Absolutely. And the last one the sources highlight is master the message. His presentations were legendary for a reason.
Yeah, not just data dumps. They informed, educated, and crucially entertained. Visual storytelling.
Yeah.
Making people want the product.
Getting people excited. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
And you see how these principles drove that incredible string of hits after his return.
Oh, yeah. iMac, iBook, then the iTunes Music Store getting those tough record label deals, then the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Bringing iTunes to Windows, which was huge for dominance. Then the iPhone just changed everything with that touch screen. Apple TV, dropping computer from the name, becoming Apple Inc.
MacBook Air, seemingly impossibly thin. The iPad, creating a whole new category, iCloud tying it together. It's just an unbelievable run. And the sources tracking Apple's value show that legacy continued under Tim Cook, hitting $1 trillion in 2018, then $2 trillion just 2 years later, built on the foundation Jobs rebuilt.
Now, we can't really do a deep dive into the sources on Jobs without touching on his health, which the material does address. His diagnosis in 2003 with that rare pancreatic cancer, a GEP net.
Right. And there's a medical journal article among the sources that discusses his decision initially to try alternative therapies, camium, complementary, and alternative medicine.
Things like acupuncture, diet, botanicals, for about 9 months before he had surgery in 2004.
Yeah. And the article tackles the speculation head on. Did that delay affect his outcome? But it's very clear the specifics of his case aren't public. So it's actually impossible to know if different choices would have changed things.
That's an important clarification from the source.
It is. And the article uses it to make a broader point, really.
Yeah.
It frames his choices as an example of making decisions under conditions of medical uncertainty, even when you have immense resources. It highlights how many patients use CAM and the real nift for more rigorous research into all kinds of therapies, conventional and alternative, so people can make better informed decisions. It's a reminder that these are complex choices, often made without perfect information.
That's a really powerful point, actually. He resigned as CEO in August 2011 and passed away that October.
Yeah, a huge loss felt worldwide. But as we've seen digging through these sources, his legacy is just immense across computing, animation, music, mobile, retail, carried on by Apple today.
So let's wrap up this deep dive. We've traced the journey in these sources. Co-founding Apple, the ouster, the really influential work at NXT, revolutionizing animation with Pixar, then the incredible return to Apple.
Saving it, really.
Yeah.
And leading it to unprecedented heights, all driven by these distinct principles we've unpacked from his experiences.
It definitely cements his place in that legends category. Someone whose actions just fundamentally reshaped multiple industries. You can really see the blueprint in the sources.
No question.
And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, drawing from one source's conclusion in our discussion. When you're up against a tough problem or a decision where you don't have all the answers, think about some of these patterns from Jobs' story.
Yeah, like that intense focus, that willingness to make a hard pivot when needed, or the value of deliberately seeking out diverse perspectives, connecting those unexpected dots.
Or maybe reflecting on that health discussion, how critical is getting the best possible information, even when resources aren't an issue, when you're facing those really significant choices.
Definitely something to chew on.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources behind the legend of Steve Jobs. We really appreciate you spending the time with us.